Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're revisiting the Acer Predator X27U OLED gaming monitor after it received a large firmware update several months ago. Acer made me aware of this update, saying it addressed some of the criticism I had of the product, including the lack of a uniform brightness setting and lower overall brightness compared to some of its rivals. I always like going back and revisiting a product whenever it receives a big update to see whether it's now worth recommending, and of course to give a fair representation of the product in its current state, like we've done for other monitors from brands like Dell, Asus and Cooler Master. Going back to my initial X27U review, I had several big issues with it that ultimately prevented me from recommending it. Compared to other monitors with similar specs, the Acer model was lacking in key features, especially for those that wanted to use it for desktop apps. All other models I'd tested up until this point had featured a uniform brightness setting, which disabled the automatic brightness limiter in the SDR mode and allowed for a consistent level of brightness regardless of the size of windows or average picture level. This makes the desktop app experience a lot better as it removes the annoying behavior of brightness fluctuations as you move and resize windows. I was also disappointed with the level of brightness for both SDR and HDR usage. SDR brightness was much lower than the LG and Asus models, hitting just 136 nits full screen and compounded by the annoying ABL behavior, compared to 200 nits for the LG and 240 nits for the Asus. It also had slightly lower HDR brightness than the Corsair and LG models, with significantly lower brightness than what Asus were offering. On top of this, I found it annoying the way the X27U switched between HDR and SDR modes, requiring users to manually turn on or off the HDR setting in the OSD to get the best experience. There were also issues with HDR accuracy, particularly EOTF tracking, so you can see why I might not have recommended the Acer model up against its competitors that just didn't have many of these drawbacks and offered a nicer overall experience. Firmware Update 2.0 seeks to remedy some of these concerns and is available to download and install from Acer's website. All you have to do is hook up the monitor to your PC via a USB cable, open up Acer's software, load in the firmware file that comes in the download package and hit update. Very straightforward process that on my system took less than 10 minutes to apply with zero issues. As promised, Firmware 2.0 does introduce a uniform brightness setting labeled in the OSD as constant brightness, which thankfully is available when using any of the monitor's built-in modes. This is a very effective feature that works as advertised, disabling the automatic brightness limiter and applying a constant level of brightness regardless of the average picture level on screen. This makes it much more pleasant to use for desktop applications, as dragging around and resizing windows no longer causes noticeable increases or decreases to brightness. But the benefits for desktop applications don't stop there, because this firmware update also substantially raises full screen brightness. My unit went from 136 nits before the update to 207 nits after the update, with the same level of calibration and white balance applied. And that 207 nits applies consistently across all window sizes with the constant brightness feature enabled. With that setting switched off, 207 becomes your minimum brightness for full screen, and brightness increases from there with lower APL as you would expect. This makes the X27U much more competitive with the LG and Asus models, as well as the AOC model that I've since reviewed for SDR usage. Unfortunately, we aren't getting an unlocked sRGB mode or any improvements to factory calibration, which was average for the initial firmware, but at least now the monitor isn't as dim or annoying to use. I think most buyers will be much happier with the performance after the firmware update, and I would strongly recommend buyers apply it. However, be warned that running an OLED monitor at a high level of brightness for static desktop apps could lead to faster burn-in, not that this is an issue typically when playing games or watching videos. While I was happy with the improvements Acer have made to the SDR experience, Firmware 2.0 only goes part of the way to addressing the issues I had with the monitor in my review. In particular, this firmware update doesn't really change the HDR experience at all, meaning there are still issues with how the display works in the HDR mode. HDR accuracy hasn't improved, so there are still problems with EOTF tracking, particularly in the upper part of the range, where output brightness remains a bit wonky and too high relative to what it should be. I also only saw a negligible increase to HDR brightness for small window sizes. Previously, I was getting around 633 nits for a 10% window and 730 nits for a 2% window. That's gone up to 642 nits and 745 nits respectively, which is hardly worth talking about. It certainly doesn't bring the Acer model up to the level of the Asus PG27AQDM, although in fairness, HDR brightness is similar at those window sizes to most other 27-inch 1440p 240Hz OLEDs. What was good to see is increased full screen brightness in the HDR mode. In fact, Acer are offering the best experience of all the monitors here, with 228 nits at a 100% window size compared to just 138 nits with the old firmware. This is a higher level of brightness than even the PG27AQDM that tops out at 196 nits, although once we get to 25% window sizes and smaller, the Asus model ends up being much brighter. I typically think smaller window size brightness is more important than larger window sizes for the HDR experience overall, but it's still good to see an improvement here, even if accuracy remains a bit wonky. Higher full screen brightness also helps out for those that want to use the display for occasional desktop use, but don't want to switch out of the HDR mode to do so. Perhaps the biggest annoyance for me is that the HDR SDR switching issue is still present with firmware 2.0, and Acer even tells me this was intentional to allow users to switch the HDR function by themselves. The two options in the OSD are HDR off or HDR auto. In theory, when set to auto, the display should automatically switch to the HDR mode when an HDR signal is detected, switching back to the SDR mode for SDR signals. Off would then preserve SDR for all signals. But that's not what happens. Instead, when set to auto, the X27U remains in the HDR mode regardless of whether the input signal is HDR or SDR, making auto more of an on mode. The HDR mode does handle both HDR and SDR signals to some degree and delivers a proper HDR experience, but the SDR experience is compromised and delivers worse accuracy than switching the display to HDR off. It also fails to preserve any configuration differences you might have between the HDR and SDR modes. For example, in the HDR mode, you might want to have brightness set to 100 for the brightest experience and the constant brightness feature set to off so brightness isn't limited. Then in the SDR mode, you might want to set brightness to 50, turn on constant brightness for desktop apps, and maybe even use the sRGB mode. That's a typical user scenario which works well when a monitor switches properly between an SDR and HDR configuration depending on the signal. But the X27U always running in the HDR mode when the HDR setting is set to auto means that the same configuration and settings are used regardless of whether the signal is HDR or SDR. When HDR is set to auto, you can't use the sRGB mode at all, for example. This means that you still need to switch settings in the OSD every time you switch between HDR and SDR. With the constant brightness setting decoupled from the mode as well, to go from the best SDR to best HDR experience, you'll need to enter the OSD every time and switch the HDR setting to auto and the constant brightness setting to off, reversing those settings when switching back from HDR to SDR. That's an annoying experience. Ideally, you could just turn on HDR in Windows and not have to enter the OSD at all, as your settings will be preserved in the right mode. This might seem like a pretty small nitpick, but it's one of those quality of life options that you do get from other monitors that properly switch between HDR and SDR states. The ideal setups for each mode can be quite different, which is why handling this change in mode is very important. Acer needs to put in more work here, and I don't agree with their choice to make this behavior intentional. After this retest of the X27U, the question now surrounds whether it's worth recommending it. Acer are currently selling the X27U for $800 US, which is a very good price, down from its $1,000 launch MSRP, now matching the AOC AG276QZD, and coming in cheaper than the LG, Corsair and Asus models in the US. That price adjustment combined with several firmware fixes certainly changes my opinion of the model to some degree. I'm not nearly as negative on it as I was to begin with. I still think the experience you get from the LG 27GR95QE and Asus PG27AQDM are superior to what Acer are offering, with better HDR accuracy and, in the case of the Asus model, higher HDR brightness. But the price is now much more appropriate, with Acer offering their model at a discount. If all were priced at about the same level, say at their $1,000 MSRPs, I would clearly get the Asus model, but at a $100 to $200 discount and with key firmware fixes, the Acer model is more attractive and more appropriately positioned. The biggest battle here is between the X27U and AOC AG276QZD that I recently reviewed, both at $800 US. These are very similar products with similar HDR accuracy and brightness, although the AOC model is brighter for SDR usage and somewhat more accurate, with the Acer model offering a USB-C input with power delivery. But what seals the deal for me is the AOC model better handles the HDR-SDR transition, a nice quality of life benefit for those that frequently change between the two. The AOC model isn't perfect there either. It should be preserving the uniform brightness configuration you set for the HDR and SDR mode separately, but it does handle the HDR-SDR transition better for other settings. Ultimately, I think Acer are pretty close here to having a great OLED offering if they can maintain its price at around $800 US. They're probably only one firmware update away, though Acer have not made any promises of future updates, nor have they provided new firmware in about 3 months. Still, the X27U has gone from me saying you should probably avoid it to now being reasonably competitive, which is very much a step in the right direction. Anyway, that's it for this relook at the Acer Predator X27U. If you do appreciate me going through and testing various firmware updates, then please let me know in the comments below. Give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, do all that good stuff. And if you do want to support our independent testing, we have our Patreon and Float Plan accounts. Links to those are in the description below as well. You get some nice benefits and perks like our Discord community and monthly live streams. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.